I began my journey through Latin America in Mexico City, where I lived in a shared house for a few months. David was the youngest resident. He was 17 years old, grew up in the suburbs of Cancun, and moved to Mexico City for university. He had never taken public transportation and never shopped for his own groceries. On the night he moved in, I found him in the kitchen at 9 p.m. eating green jello out of a plastic container. I asked him if that was his dinner, and he said no, it was dessert. He had cereal for dinner. I suppose this was the moment my maternal instinct kicked in. The next day, I took him with me to the supermarket. I showed him the difference between a ripe and unripe tomato, and how to select leafy greens. We got home, and I demonstrated a simple broccoli stir-fry with garlic, oil, and salt. I said he could apply the same technique to other vegetables, but he seemed to form an attachment to broccoli because I never saw him stir-fry anything else. The only thing he knew how to make was tuna tostadas, something that didn't require turning on the stove. I leaned against the kitchen counter and watched as he confidently diced the raw tuna fillet and laid out the other ingredients. He seemed to have everything under control until I saw him wash the cucumber with a sponge and dish detergent. David and I had a lot in common. We both grew up in the quiet, insular life of the suburbs before moving to the big city at the tender age of 17 for university. He studied music and sound engineering. I studied art and design. My first year was difficult. I struggled with eating healthy while on a budget. I had roommates who disliked me. I was surrounded by classmates who were more talented than me. There was a brief moment when I thought about dropping out. A few sessions with the school psychiatrist helped, but what I needed most back then was a guiding hand to ease me into this new phase of life. David decided he didn't like university after the first week. Classes were boring, and his classmates, who were all guys, seemed to hate him. They falsely assumed he was rich because he was from Cancun, and somehow being rich was bad. They were wrong. He didn't come from a rich family at all. When he got the highest score on an exam, his classmates disliked him even more. Someone even put a piece of paper on his desk with a nasty message inside. I told David to ignore them, focus on his studies, and think of ways to build a career out of his skills so he could be independent. It was a shame his classmates were so unfriendly, but the truth is, not everyone makes lifelong friendships during their university years. I took David everywhere with me. He never tried Asian food before, so I took him to eat Japanese ramen, soba, and Chinese hot pot. He liked spicy food, but wasn't ready for the power of Sichuan peppercorns. He was unsteady with chopsticks. I was afraid he'd drop something into the boiling pot and splash the spicy broth into his eyes. Luckily, that didn't happen. We explored the vibrant neighborhood of Coyoacán and stopped at a dessert shop with an enormous bloody crucifix hanging over the ice cream flavors, reminding us who died so we could enjoy our mint chocolate chip cones. David was self-conscious about his thin frame. On a walk past an outdoor gym, he sagely remarked, "It's hard to find a good man who also has good abs." Once, we went to salsa and bachata class in the park. At first, he was excited to learn, but then he had a small panic attack after realizing he'd be dancing with actual people. He assumed we dance with imaginary partners. I asked him when he learned to play the guitar, did he imagine the guitar or use a real one? He was silent for a moment. Then he said he was afraid the people around him would laugh at his beginner level. I pointed to a little girl learning how to rollerblade and asked if he was laughing at her beginner level. He was silent again. He gathered up the courage to go through with the lessons that afternoon, but never went again after I left Mexico City. His true love was music. He had perfect pitch and composed in his spare time. He was pale, with a mop of thick, dark hair, and large brown eyes that made him look even younger than his 17 years. In the evenings, we often sat on the patio and talked. I had been reading Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser. It's a love story between a Confederate soldier who deserted the army during the American Civil War and a Southern belle struggling to learn how to maintain her farm after her father passes away. It struck me that the woman never left her home, yet she managed to change so much and learn the skills she needed in order to be independent. It's a reminder that transformation isn't always about physical travel. You don't need to wander the world like I do in order to gain wisdom, insight, and inner strength. All three can be nurtured right where you are. David's high school sweetheart was also attending university in Mexico City. Valentina was 20 years old and studying architecture. He loved her very much, but was concerned about their future. At age 17, he knew he didn't want children. At age 20, she knew she wanted her first child by the time she turned 27. David wanted to get a vasectomy as soon as he turned 18. He argued condoms weren't always effective, and it wasn't fair for Valentina to change her hormonal cycle with birth control. I agreed, but I was taken aback at his willingness to change his body. I've known quite a few men, older and presumably wiser, who were also very clear about not wanting children. None of them volunteered to take the same measures as David. I did not expect this 17-year-old boy to raise the bar for men. I decided not to support or deter him, and to simply listen. I knew I didn't want children when I was a mere child, but I do believe I'm an outlier in this regard, and didn't want to sway David in this personal decision when he was so young. The musings of a young adult can be profound, but the gap between intention and action can be vast, and influenced by a multitude of factors. Life's plans often take unexpected turns. Not everyone does what they say they will do, especially at such a young age. After our conversation, I actually looked into the details of the procedure, and unlike hysterectomies, vasectomies are reversible. If he did actually go through with it and changed his mind later in life, it was still possible for him to have children. Even though David was a gentle young man with a good heart, he too had his limits. During high school, there was a boy who had raped multiple girls. One of them was Valentina, back when she and David were just friends. After discovering her pregnancy, she tried to end her life by overdosing on sleeping pills with alcohol. She survived. The baby didn't. David found out and could not stomach the sight of the rapist walking nonchalantly through the halls at school. She had told him to forget what happened. She was no longer pregnant and just wanted to move on. None of the other victims wanted to come forward either, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. For 2,000 pesos, he hired someone to beat the rapist to a pulp. It put a stop to the rapes, at least for the rest of his high school years. Valentina's parents never found out about the pregnancy. They assumed her attempt in ending her life was out of typical teenage angst. Valentina came from a wealthy family. She lived alone in a 4-bedroom apartment in Coyoacán, one of the many properties in her grandfather's real estate portfolio. When he passed away, her parents and relatives were unhappy with the will and began fighting over his fortune. Unfortunately, Valentina's father thought David wasn't good enough, and David thought he was an arrogant prick. He wondered what he had to do to win her father over, but wasn't too worried, since he didn't actively try to keep them apart. She asked her father if David could move into her apartment since there was more than enough space, but he said no. David was sad to see me leave Mexico City, and asked several times if I was coming back. I actually did return 7 months later. David was now 18, and he hadn't changed much. The only difference was public transportation no longer intimidated him. Once he got pickpocketed on the train, but luckily there was nothing inside his wallet. Still, he regretted losing it because it was a gift. What intrigued me about him was, moving from the quiet suburbs of Cancun to the hustle and bustle of Mexico City did not corrupt him. He seemed to know exactly who he was at such a young age. He loved music, especially funk and heavy metal. He loved Japanese anime, and he loved Valentina. He wasn't interested in parties, drinking, or any of the typical vices that seduce young people when they move to big cities. Once his classmates invited him to a party, but he refused because he knew they'd be drinking heavily and using drugs. He'd rather stay home and compose music, or help Valentina with one of her art projects. There was a purity about David that made my heart ache. I wondered how the years would change him. Once he had to earn his own money, once the subject of having children has to be confronted between him and Valentina, once he's older. Moving to a new place brings numerous challenges. Find out what happens when I first moved to Mexico City in this video, where I battle sleep deprivation, language barriers, and the ever-present feeling of self-doubt.